Right, it looks like it's all working. Good stuff. So good morning, Cardiff. Welcome to B-Sides Cymru. And as Craig said, I had the honor and the pleasure to open the very first one. And so I've got the honor and pleasure to be here again as a keynote speaker. And before I begin, I do want to also share my thanks to Craig and Tom and the team for having me back. Obviously, the sponsors for helping put on this event, because without them, we can't do this. And really thanks to all of you guys for being here today, because obviously we do this for you, but obviously if you're not here, I've got nobody to speak to. I'm just going to stand in my hotel room and talk to the wall. So while I was ruminating on what I wanted to talk about, I had all these sort of creative crises going. I always want to do like this real cool hacksery demo kind of thing. And I was like, well, I should probably leave that to the experts, the people that are going to be giving all the talks and the great talks today and in all the tracks. And I started thinking about what a keynote is, and really it's a speech that kind of sets the tone and the theme for a conference. And since there isn't really an official theme for this conference, I thought I'll propose one. And the theme I want to, or at least the tone and the theme I want to go with, is something about adaptation and readiness. So in biology, adaptation, it refers to a few related things. So it's the evolutionary process of natural selection that fits an organism to its environment, and it's the state reached by that population during that process, and then it encompasses things like the functional traits that are maintained by and continue to evolve through natural selection. And one of the most famous examples of that, of adaptation, is that of Darwin's finches, which he used when he presented to the Zoological Society of London in 1837. Now, cybercriminals have been adapting and evolving in response to our activities since day one. And it's that adaptation that's fueled this game of cat and mouse that many of us are so unfortunately very familiar with. And so, the InfoSec graybeards, myself included, that are all in this room, know all too well what I'm talking about. And those of you who are just starting out security, just don't worry. You'll get your turn. You'll see what I'm talking about. Now, where the analogy breaks down is obviously adaptation in natural selection happens over millennia, right? That's a slow process. But with cybercriminals, it operates on much tighter and much smaller timescales. And the adaptation that does occur is not always uniform. Sometimes it's practical and sometimes it's technical. And in the world of spam and phishing alone, there's plenty of examples that point to cybercriminal adaptation, many of which are indeed practical. So we've known for a long time that crime groups will repurpose their infrastructure to reflect whatever's happening in the world. Early on in the pandemic, we started seeing all sorts of spam coming from cybercriminals using all different types of lures. And what's interesting about this one is if you look at the plain text versus the HTML version, this is just a bog standard delivery spam that we see all the time. But for the pandemic, they decided they were going to change the HTML to be COVID-related, COVID-themed, whereas they just didn't bother to change the text template that was underneath it all. And we continue to see things like this, and unfortunately, true to form, less than 24 hours after the devastating earthquake that struck Turkey and Syria, we started seeing spam impersonating legitimate relief organizations. And in this case, they're impersonating a relief organization called Global Giving. But if you actually click on the Donate Now button, the link goes to a scam site, givetoturkey.org, as opposed to the globalgiving.org domain. And that scam domain was registered on the 7th. So a day after the earthquake hit, it got registered on Namecheap. And we know it's fake because the real one's hosted on AWS. This one is not. And of course, it's protected by Cloudflare. Now, trigger warning. I'm going to get to the obligatory ChatGPT portion of the talk. It's 2023, right? You got to do it. This is a real sample from our spam traps, and you look at it, it's kind of clumsy, right? It's not really that great. But we thought, well, it'd be interesting to see, what would ChatGPT do with something like this? So we asked it to write a version of something like this for us, and this is what it came up with, right? So it's pretty good if you ask me. And we asked it to do a couple different things, like change, our bank or direct deposit info of our bank in a letter to HR. But there are two factors that make this dangerous. The first is that up until now, it really wasn't practical to get computers to craft these lures in a convincing way. And the technology is not only available to do this, but it's really easily accessible. And the second is that the primary way that we've sort of trained and instructed our users to not fall for things like this is to look for things like spelling and grammar mistakes. Well, that's gone now, right? And so the user training needs to shift, so we need to adapt to a new world where you can't watch for spelling mistakes anymore. They just won't be there. The grammar will be correct, the language will be colloquial, and it will be very convincing. So we need to switch our messaging to a more risk-based approach to verification about who it is that you're communicating with. So are you being asked to do something with financial data or with a password or with sensitive data? Well, if you are, then maybe you need to pick up the phone and confirm whom it is you're communicating with. And I know that, there's been a lot of news about ChatGPT and how it's wrong most of the time, or at least a lot of the time. And I don't think that's really productive, because I don't want to overstate the harm of things like ChatGPT and all these other large language models. And we're seeing it in other aspects as well, like audio and video. But also, let's not underestimate its utility to cybercriminals and the way they're going to adapt and use these tools for nefarious means. Now we look at some of the technical changes that the cybercriminals have orchestrated over the years. One really salient example for me is over last year, we saw some interesting things. So when Mark of the Web started being adopted more widely, and when we stopped running macros by default on Windows in Office documents, cybercriminals were trying to figure out, okay, well, how can we still get our payloads in there, right? So there was all sorts of things that were tried. There were some Mark of the Web bypasses that came out, and then they got patched, and so it was back to this cat and mouse thing, right? And this was just a way to try to still run macros on these platforms. And the one really interesting thing that we noticed was this shift towards lesser known types of extensions. And you started getting this sort of like nesting doll approach to smuggling in payloads as a security bypass onto operating systems. And so that you'd have this PowerShell script that was wrapped, that was inside an LNK file, that was inside a zip file, that was inside an ISO, right? And so that was really just to try to get those payloads on there. And the response to that in November of this past year, Microsoft did actually start propagating some of these artifacts, these Mark of the Web artifacts, into disk images, and so the cycle starts all over again. But you can see that even in response to things that were fairly new, the cybercriminals adapted and responded fairly quickly. Even in one topic alone, like ransomware, we can see that there is a shift over the years. So in the beginning, we had, well, Let's forget about the original 1989 AIDS Trojan, which kind of was the progenitor of ransomware of all kinds. But if we look at the sort of modern landscape, we had fake AV. And this is generally, you would have a pop-up on your machine that would say, you are infected with a Trojan horse, and all of these legitimate engines didn't detect it, but we did. And so if you want to clean your computer, then just click this button. And in fact, if you wanted to clean your computer, there was nothing on there. It was just programmatic. They said you were infected, but you had to pay them $79.99 or whatever local currency and amount was displayed to you. And you could actually use Visa and American Express and MasterCard to pay for this transaction. And so the security industry responded to this by talking to the payment processors and saying, like, we know these are scams. Like, there's nothing behind this stuff. You need to stop processing these payments. And that's what happened, is the payment processors eventually stopped doing it. Visa was the last one to get on board, but eventually they all did it, and the cybercriminals had to respond and adapt. And the next thing they did was the police viruses, or the police lockers. And what these were, again, was a pop-up. It would sometimes, it would just lock up your session and say that you'd done something illegal. And it was usually around, like, you had pornography on your laptop or on your machine, or you had downloaded illegal videos and movies and songs. And honestly, who hasn't done that in this room, right? But because that was the case, and because they always branded it with local police agencies, so depending on the country you were in, would depend on what banner you got at the very top. So in this case, there's the UK Metropolitan Police, and there's some for every police service around the world. They say you would have to pay a fine, and it ranged, interestingly, it ranged in sort of the $300 to $500 range, which was kind of like where we got to with ransomware as well. But you'd pay, in this case, with prepaid cards, right? So Ucash, Green Dot Money Pack, and all sorts of other cards. And again, as a security industry, we're like, we need to respond to this. We need to figure out how to stop this stuff because it's costing a lot of money to victims. And so we worked with these prepaid card merchants and said, let's start shutting this stuff down as much as possible, to the point where they even started printing out like a warning on the back of when you go to Tesco's and you buy one of these, it's usually like a cardboard sleeve, and on the back of it said, beware of these types of scams. If you're buying this because you've been instructed to buy it online, you might want to think twice about that. And so we cut off their revenue stream again. But there was this was around, I would say, like 2011, 2012. And there was this little thing called Bitcoin that had just recently kind of been invented. And the criminals thought, that could be useful. And so the modern grandfather, if you will, or father of crypto ransomware was born in the form of CryptoLocker. As a matter of fact, this September will mark the 10th anniversary of when this came out in September of 2013. And even within, like I said, within ransomware itself, we see a constant adaptation and response to, and a readiness to be able to shift with the changing landscape. So ransomware in this style was generally a sort of like a very closed off operation where you'd have maybe one or a group of people that were doing everything. And then we switched to, fast forward to today, we've got this ransomware as a service model. And then ransomware as a service, when it started, and ransomware itself when it started, was very much all about the encryption. But then as we shift through time, we see that we get things like double encryption, right? They steal the data and they leak it as well. And you get DDoS attacks. And you get all sorts of little goodies that are bundled in with the extortion. And it's not just the encryption anymore. Because part of it is we've gotten better at stopping this encryption with a lot of the tools that we have today. And then this sort of automatic, programmatic kind of attack on victims switched to a more hands-on approach. And those of you who are in the trenches fighting this kind of stuff, you know what I'm talking about. These guys will actually be in your networks, touching all of your servers and doing all that havoc. And also the switch from like physical machines to virtual machines has prompted a lot of the more prominent groups today, and I'm seeing this with a lot of them advertising. We go after Windows, Linux, and ESXi, right? So a lot of them now are crafting specific payloads to go after ESXi servers, because that's where all our data is now. It's all in virtual machines in these big data centers. And, ESXi ARGs, that vulnerability that popped last weekend, I think it was, right, has really shown that they will use any and every opportunity they can to get into our networks. And then on a less technical side, we've got things like authentication, right? So in the beginning, it was all about just stealing your password. You got the password, and you went. And then we started adding things like two-factor authentication with, maybe some SMSs and maybe some TOTP tokens. And so they got clever. They figured out how can we steal those as well in addition to the passwords, and then use those to log into the services. So then we went to like a stronger multi-factor authentication with things like push-based authentication. But then they were like, okay, well, we know how to beat this. We'll just send you 100 of these at 3:00 in the morning and see how you respond. And most of the people will just go, fine, you just want it to stop, right? And we've seen Lapsus was one of the groups that used this to great effect to break into a bunch of companies, to breach a bunch of companies in the last couple of years. And so now we've evolved and adapted and switched to verified push, right? Which is seemingly at this point a very strong way of doing authentication. But the cyber criminals are constantly looking for those little ways that they can adapt their methods to circumvent our defenses. So every year I do an analysis of all the incident response investigations that we do throughout a calendar year. And the goal is to understand what the cyber criminals are doing so that it can then inform our defense. The reality, though, is that many of the tools and techniques remain the same year on year. And yet, year on year, organizations are still falling victim to the same old tricks. Now, some say, like, there's so many tools and techniques, what am I supposed to do about it? As a matter of fact, in my last report, it was over 300 tools that were used by cyber criminals and over 200 techniques. So it's a big number. But there are some things you can do that will have outsized effects on your security posture, right? Like blocking applications or tightening up your outbound firewall rules, monitoring everything. And and looking at the logs. And then just hardening identity to the point where, you're doing things like verified push. These 4 things alone can really dramatically improve the resilience against attack, but it also shows an adaptation and a readiness to respond. But don't take my word for it. Cybercriminals, they've been ready to adapt to whatever impediments we've thrown their way, and it's time we turn the tables and let's see what we can learn from them. So Black Cat is one of these groups that has always been sort of on the podium, if you will, in the last couple of years, right? They're never usually at the top, so Lockbit is sort of the de facto leader these days. But they've always been sort of second or third, sort of like hiding in the mess of what is ransomware today. And if you look at some of the ways that they go about their business, right? Some of the tools that they use, some of the techniques that they use, you see some very familiar things, and it's very consistent across a lot of these groups. They typically all do the same thing. So it should be easy for us to adapt and respond to this, yet a lot of people are still falling victim to things like Black Cat and ransomware in general. And so we had one investigation specifically that, unfortunately, the victim, their circumstances dictated that they had to pay. And because of that, they got their decryption key, but they also got a pen test report from the affiliate. So I'm thinking, well, let's have a look at this and see, because it describes exactly what it is they did and the steps they took and the tools they used and the techniques. And so maybe we can learn something from this. Because clearly, I've been up here for years telling you guys to start patching your stuff and harden your identity, but you're not listening to me, so let's listen to them. All right, so, and this sort of loosely goes along the MITRE attack framework of, attack phases, so from initial access all the way out to impact. And so you can see, it says here, you had a critical log4j vulnerability. Like, you were not a target, it was just bulk scanning, right? So if there are things that you can learn from this, it's that, what opportunities do you have to make sure that you don't end up on one of their lists? Because most most victims aren't targeted. They are opportunistically gathered and then triaged, and then some are, but for the most part, they aren't. And what I call the earliest IOC here is like the very first sign of attack we saw with these guys was 38 days before the attack even started. And then so after they infiltrated the network, it was, it wasn't hard to find your administrators, and then we just put backdoors everywhere, right? So some persistence there. Cobalt Strike, Brute Ratel, Terra RMM, Splashtop, AnyDesk. 5 different tools they use for this kind of persistence. So this is why I said blocking applications, right? Great opportunity to, if you use AnyDesk, fine. But you don't need to have Splashtop and a Terra on there as well if you're using a tool like AnyDesk for remote access. As far as defense evasion goes, right? We went for the backup servers, but then we also went for all sorts of other stuff as well, right? So they give a little bit of advice throughout this stuff, and actually at the bottom of that side, there's a whole general recommendation section, which we won't go through all that. But yeah, so they went through the back, and for doing that, they used a tool called PDQ Inventory, and it's very prominent in a set of tools that the criminals use. But, they were basically going and finding everything they could and using it to their advantage. When it comes to credential access, it's clear that having a database of passwords for all your services on the local, that's a bad idea, right? Ask Uber how they feel about that, because they fell victim to this exact same technique. But it also speaks a little bit to the fact that you do have time, right? So it's not all doom and gloom. It's not that this stuff's going to happen in 30 seconds, or was it gone in 60 seconds, right? They took a few days to actually verify everything, make sure that it's all working, make sure that they're going to accomplish what they need to accomplish. And so you do have time, and there are these signposts along the way, right? Now, I could have cropped this before, I had to include this. So this is literally right below. It says we have to say Sophos is a good AV, but the real point here is that no one monitors the logs. At least they don't do so on weekends, right? So it's so important today that you are constantly on top of it, because they will say on the weekend when you're not watching, because they're watching you. They know your pattern of activity. They will operate on the weekends so that you are not noticing their activity. So it's really, really important, if you don't have the capability to do that yourself, that you go and find that capability from somewhere else. So once inside, your Horizon VM, we dumped credentials, got some domain admins, cracked the hashes, and moved laterally. So and RDP is by far the most used tool for lateral movement, as well as things like PS exec. And what's really good is actually we as a community, we've gotten a lot better at making sure that RDP isn't exposed to the internet. I'm not seeing as much out there as there was perhaps at the beginning of the pandemic or even before the pandemic. But internally, it's used almost 100% of the time, and for Black Hat specifically, it's used 100% of the time. They love using RDP. So if there's a way to monitor your traffic to understand, should this host be talking to that host, then that's a signal that you can act on, and you can adapt your security posture to reflect changes that will prevent that from happening. And then finally, from an exfiltration point of view, so while the attack plan was being drafted, so again, a little bit of time, and there's always time. So the median dwell time for ransomware is 11 days. So from when the attack actually starts to when it gets detected is 11 days, at least for this year's data set. But there's also another one that I looked at, which was, when did they start exfiltrating or start dumping, the exfiltration tools onto the network, to when did the ransomware launch? And that's 1.8 days. So even then, you still have some time. If you can detect one of these tools, and 7-zip, WinRAR were very much used in this attack and are used extensively. All these multi-part archives are really easy to do with those tools. And so they can trickle out your data. And so if you're not watching and this is why I mentioned outbound firewall rules, if you're not watching the outbound traffic, then you might miss that big spike of terabytes of data that just went out the front door while you were sleeping. So it doesn't take much for water to do damage, right? A small crack will do. And cyber criminals are equally opportunistic, and they will exploit anything they can. Now, there's an old saying in InfoSec, which is the criminals only need to be right once and the defenders need to be right all the time. But I really think that's a bit outdated, because when in reality, when cybersecurity is done right, the cyber criminals have to be right every time, and we only need to detect them once. And so as we put in these layers, as we do this monitoring, as we use the tools at our disposal, and the humans that help us do all of this, then we can detect them and we can evict them and hopefully limit the damage to an intrusion versus them stealing all your data. And just like a good phishing email has a strong call to action, I'm going to take a page from the cyber criminals, and I'm going to propose one for you as well. So as you're listening to all the talks today, think about what they're trying to tell you. And to all the presenters, as you're delivering your message, if it's relevant to your talk, try to convey and help your audience understand why you're telling your story, why it's important, and perhaps what can be done about this particular problem. Because adaptation is about change in response to your environment, and readiness is about being open and receptive to that change. And not all change has to be technical. It could be a new process, or it could be a new policy. So as you're listening to the talks, think about how you can affect change when you go back to work on Monday morning. And if you're a student, or you're not currently employed, or you're just interested in cybersecurity and that's why you're here, think about things that you can do in your own life that can institute change and maybe make you less of an opportunistic target. So, since the threat landscape is dynamic, it takes the defense against the onslaught of cyber criminal activity takes a dynamic approach. And so we have to be ready. Responding to this dynamic environment means you need to be ready to respond. So, in closing, and in the immortal words of the late, great Godfather of Soul, may he rest in peace, if you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready. So, stay ready and stay secure. Thank you. So I was supposed to do 30 minutes, and I only did 24. So I wasn't going to take questions, but if there are any questions, I'd happy to take them. You can shout, and then I will repeat the question. Yep. The question is, do we look at the dwell time and then try to make inferences about things like IABs, initial access brokers, and when the initial access happened to when they were sold to when the actual attack happened. So it's tough to do that. In the data set that I have access to, it's sometimes possible, and that is my inference, is like when you see a long dwell time in a company, that's usually because that inventory sat on the shelf for a while. And then eventually they got popped. I also looked, so you might have seen earliest IOC as well. That was something that when I look at all the IOCs, I look massive spreadsheets with lots of lines of logs in them, and I'll see, okay, well, we know that the attack that occurred is related to this incident here. But then there's also stuff above that in the spreadsheet. And so the earliest IOC for me is going back and looking and seeing what else was on the network before this all mess started, right? And so there's some correlations there. But directly to answer your question, sometimes we can tell because you'll see that, okay, well, there was a log4j actually more relevant to that data set, proxy logon and proxy shell specifically. On August 18th, when the POC got released, boom, victims right away that day, right? And so that was IAB activity, no doubt. And then a little bit later on, then we saw other activity. So we saw a log on to a server, right? And so that's kind of that delta. I guess I could add that delta to the data set, but it's not always there. So that's why I don't call it out specifically. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, great. I think you had his hand up first. No worries. Right.
Why do you think they've done that other than ego, their ego? If they're physically attacking someone and extorting them, why would they then try and help? It seems a bit odd.
Because one of the reasons is they call themselves post-paid pen testers. And if you go to the Lockbit blog, they actually say that in writing, right? They literally think they're helping people. They literally think they're doing a service by doing that, by breaching a company, causing all sorts of havoc, stealing their data, collecting the money afterwards. And then, well, why not? You've already paid us, so we might as well give you something for your troubles beyond just the decryption key. But literally, for some of them, it's just that simple. They think they're doing a public service, and that's part of their service.
What are you seeing as far as compromised vectors? Primarily 0 days or primarily older exploits?
Well, so in my latest data set, it was 47% of the root causes were due to an exploiting a vulnerability. And most of them, in that, we had a bit of a bad year. So that data set was for the year when proxy shell, proxy log, and all those things came out, and log4j at the end of the year, right? Kind of had a bad year for that. So they were just jumping on it. Email is, and exposed remote services are still very, very much used. But as far as vulnerabilities go, it does run the gamut. And in non-explosive 0-day years, we are seeing, as with ESXi args, right? Like, that's a 2-year-old vulnerability, right? They will use that to their advantage. So it is kind of like a mixed bag when it comes to that. It can. So with regards to spear phishing attacks, does DMARC provide protection? So DMARC SPF can do some things to protect your domain, but at the end of the day, these guys will get SPF records. They will. What's that? And yeah, so they will, the really good cyber criminals, and I mean, Team Kummer can probably speak to this, they will set up infrastructure that they've got all their certificates. I mean, they just go and they steal signing certificates for drivers for these days. Like, we're seeing this so much more these days. The well-resourced teams, of which many of these ransomware crews are well-resourced because of the money they're making, they set up infrastructure that is pretty bulletproof sometimes. And so they will use all the technologies that we kind of try to use for good. They use them for their purposes as well, for OPSEC, for all sorts of things. But a lot of times, yeah, they'll just use the same technology we do. So I think that's my time. So again, thank you very much. Enjoy the talks. Unfortunately, I've got to go back to Canada today, so I'm going to leave. But it was great seeing you all. Thank you.